Sable Thorn kicked the rusted metal door and it groaned open like a hungover lion. It probably wasn't supposed to open, given they were trapped in this quarantine zone on Mars, somewhere between what fresh hell and get me out of here. Just how she liked it complicated. Always with the drama, Sable, she muttered to herself. Behind her, a voice piped up. You know, kicking's not the universal solution, said Marlowe, the team's so-called communications expert, whose communicative skills with electronics were only rivaled by his ability to constantly piss her off. And yet, Sable replied, stepping over the threshold, it works surprisingly often. The room beyond was a mess of blinking lights, the kind of ominous, non-reassuring glow you might expect from a haunted jukebox. The air smelled faintly of burnt toast, which was either a sign of electrical malfunction or a neurological incident. Marlowe followed, his eyes darting around like a paranoid squirrel looking for its last acorn. I don't think we're supposed to be here, he added helpfully. No shit, Sherlock, said Sable. But since we're here, let's make it count. The quarantine zone on Mars wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot unless you were into red dust and existential dread. Sable and her team, however, had found themselves here without much choice. It was supposed to be a routine maintenance gig, check the systems, and be done before Martian breakfast, which was coincidentally Earth lunch, but way less appetizing. Of course, that all went to hell when they discovered the mysterious force field locking them in. Quarantine, the automated voice had droned. For your safety. Sure, because safety always involved being trapped without consent. Real cozy. What do you reckon, Sable? Asked Gideon, the group's muscle, though most of his strength seemed to reside in his jawline. Sable liked him. He was like a tank with a heart of gold if the tank was a little rusty and prone to breakdowns. I reckon we're about to find out why the universe hates us today. She moved deeper into the room, her boots crunching on what looked like crushed dreams and spare circuits. At the far end, a monitor flickered, showing scrolling lines of text in a language that wasn't quite Martian, nor any dialect of get me out of here they were familiar with. It was alien in the literal and metaphorical sense. Anyone fluent in squiggly lines? Marlowe asked, pointing a thumb at the screen. I thought you were the language guy, Sable shot back. I speak binary, not hieroglyphics, he replied, crossing his arms in the universal gesture of not my problem. Sable sighed and tapped a few keys. The screen blinked and then, as if deciding English wasn't beneath it, aligned its text into something readable. What it said wasn't exactly comforting. Harvest sequence initiated. That sounds ominous, Gideon said, scratching his chin as if trying to solve the mystery of why they were always in these situations. Ominous is our bread and butter, Sable replied, feeling a familiar tingle of dread at the back of her neck. It was the same sense she got when Marlowe offered to cook. You think this has anything to do with the nightmares? Marlowe asked cautiously. Nightmares. That was the other part of their little Martian misadventure. They'd all been having them. Vivid, technicolor nightmares that made you wake up sweating buckets and reevaluating your life choices. Come to think of it, that was almost every day for Sable, but the rest of the team was less accustomed to existential crises. Possibly, Sable murmured, still staring at the monitor. Maybe someone or something's collecting them. Who'd want to collect nightmares? Gideon snorted. Seems like a lousy hobby. Probably the same folks who trap people on Mars for fun, Marlowe suggested, which was depressingly plausible. Sable ran a hand through her hair, which was now more grease than style. All right, let's find out what we're dealing with. Split up. Gideon checked the perimeter. Marlowe, see if you can get these systems talking. And you? Marlowe asked. I'll see if I can find the source of that charming harvest sequence, Sable replied, her voice laced with sarcasm as thick as the Martian atmosphere outside. They moved with purpose, though none of them would openly admit how much they wished they were anywhere else. Maybe Fiji, or a nice cold beer. Sable slipped into a side corridor, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. It was dimly lit, with the kind of ambience you'd expect from a horror movie set right before the killer shows up. She forced herself to focus. Halfway down, she found a door marked with more alien script. She pressed a hand against it, and it slid open with a hiss that was more snake than pneumatic. Inside was a laboratory of sorts. Rows of stasis pods lined the walls, each with a human inside, their faces contorted in terror even as they slept. A real party, this place. Well, that's not creepy, Sable muttered, stepping closer. Each pod pulsed with a sickly green light, like they'd been designed by someone who flunked out of evil villain school. She tapped on the glass of the nearest pod. The occupant inside, a middle-aged man, didn't stir, lost in whatever nightmarish hell his mind was trapped in. "Hey, buddy, not exactly five-star accommodations, huh?" she said, checking the readouts. Brainwave activity was off the charts, a literal buffet of fear and anxiety. "Sable, you there?" Gideon's voice crackled over the comms. "Yeah, I'm here," she replied, turning away from the pod. "Found something." People in stasis, hooked up to some kind of nightmare generator. "Well, that's different," Gideon said, with the kind of understatement usually reserved for when your spaceship is on fire. "Different's one way to put it," Marlowe interjected. "More like horror show." "Whatever it is, it's not good," Sable agreed, looking around for some sort of control panel. "I'm going to see if I can shut it down." "You think it'll stop the nightmares?" Marlowe asked. "I'd bet what little's left of my sanity on it," Sable said, though she had her doubts. If something was harvesting nightmares, it stood to reason they wouldn't be thrilled about losing their supply. She found a console and tapped a few buttons, hoping for big red OFF switch. Instead, more alien script scrolled across the screen, mocking her inability to decipher it. "Guessing's as good as any," she said, pressing a symbol that looked vaguely promising. The room trembled, lights flickering as machinery groaned into life. Sable backed away as the pods began to hum, their lights intensifying. Sable." Marlowe's voice sounded more anxious than usual. "Yeah, I noticed," she replied, moving quickly to the door. She didn't like the idea of being in a room full of people waking from nightmares, especially when they could dream up things with teeth. "Get out of there," Gideon shouted, and she didn't need telling twice. Sable ran, the door sliding shut behind her with an oppressive finality. "Well, that went well," she muttered, ducking into an alcove to catch her breath. "Did you do it?" Marlowe asked. "I did something," she replied. "Whether it's good or bad, we'll find out." "You sure have a way with confidence," Gideon said dryly. "Hey, keeps us on our toes," Sable shot back, trying to steady her breathing. The comms crackled again, but this time it wasn't Gideon or Marlowe. "Attention," said an unfamiliar voice, cold and clinical. "Unauthorized access detected. Initiating lockdown protocols." "Well, shit," Sable said. "Looks like we just poked the bear. And the bear's pissed," Marlowe added. "We need a plan," Gideon said as the building shuddered, metal groaning like a wounded beast. "Before we end up as nightmare fuel ourselves." "Agreed," Sable replied, adrenaline spiking. "Regroup at the entrance, we'll figure it out from there." "On it," Gideon said, the line going dead as he signed off. Sable pushed off the wall, adrenaline turning into determination. Whatever was going on here, they were in the thick of it now. And by the looks of things, it was going to get a hell of a lot worse before it got better. "Mars," she muttered to herself, heading down the corridor. Why did it have to be Mars? But even as she said it, she knew. Because out here, on this god-forsaken red rock, there were stories to be told. And if she had her way, they'd make it out alive to tell them. Sable was jogging down the dimly lit corridor, her mind working faster than the Martian windstorms that occasionally tried to sandblast the base into oblivion. She tried to banish the image of those poor sods in their nightmare pods. Hell, if this was a taste of their future, maybe staying in a bad dream wasn't the worst option. The comms in her ear buzzed to life again. "Hey, Sable," Marlowe's voice crackled. "Tried pinging Earth for a distress signal. Guess what?" Sable made a face as she dodged a particularly suspicious-looking puddle on the floor. "Let me guess." "They blocked our signal." "Bingo," Marlowe replied, as cheerily as a man announcing his own execution. "It's like trying to shout across space with a sock in your mouth." "Great," Sable muttered. "So we're on our own. Just us and the alien tech that's probably powered by our worst fears. Seems so, Marlowe confirmed. At least we know the nightmares are good for something. Who knew dark matter had such lousy taste in fuel? Why can't they run on good dreams? Like about endless pizza, Gideon chimed in, his voice solid and reassuring like a steel beam. Would make things a lot easier. Easy isn't in the vocabulary of whoever set this up, Sable said, her voice laced with cynicism. But if nightmares are the key, then someone on Mars is having one hell of a bad day every day. Consider us unlucky, Marlowe added. This place is the Bermuda Triangle of bad dreams. Sable reached the common area, where Marlowe was hunched over a console, his hair doing a fine impersonation of a bird's nest after a storm. Screens surrounded him, each one displaying a jumble of alien script, occasional flashes of English, and the comforting glow of impending doom. Gideon was there too, leaning against a wall with an ease that only someone with a complete disregard for danger could muster. He gave Sable a nod. "So, what's next, boss? We make our own luck," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Marlowe, keep trying to break through whatever's blocking us. If there's even a slim chance of getting a message out, I want to know." "Consider it done," Marlowe replied, his fingers already dancing over the keys like a pianist at a garbage recital. "If nightmares are fueling dark matter, then there's got to be a central point where all this tech converges," Sable continued, piecing together the puzzle in her mind. "Maybe a core or a control hub. Let me guess," Gideon said with feigned enthusiasm. "It's probably in the scariest part of the base, right?" "You know it," Sable replied with a small grin. "Nowhere else would suit our luck." Marlowe looked up from his console, brow furrowed. "Whatever we're dealing with, it's not just advanced. It's alien advanced." "Like, why bother with buttons when you can have a telepathic interface advanced?" "Great," Sable replied dryly. "Then we just have to think our way out of this mess." "Yeah, too bad my telepathy's a bit rusty," Marlowe shot back, not missing a beat. They spent the next few minutes in tense silence, the only sound the hum of machinery and Marlowe's muttered curses as he fought with the console. Occasionally, a screen would flicker to life with a burst of static, only to slip back into a calm, mocking blankness. Sable paced, her mind running through scenarios like a cat chasing its tail. None of them seemed particularly optimistic, but she wasn't about to give up. Not when giving up meant a permanent stay on this red hellhole. "All right," she said finally, stopping mid-pace. "If we can't get a message to Earth, then we need to figure out this tech. And fast. I'll see if I can get more info from these systems," Marlowe said, typing furiously. He looked like a caffeinated monkey with a vendetta against keyboards. "Meanwhile, Gideon and I will try to find this control hub," Sable decided. "If we can shut it down, maybe it'll lift the lockdown, or set off a self-destruct," Marlowe pointed out helpfully. "Always the optimist," Sable replied, rolling her eyes. "Just keep working." "On it, boss lady," Marlowe said, giving her a half-assed salute. Sable turned to Gideon, who was already on his feet, ready to follow her into whatever fresh hell awaited them. "You ready?" she asked. "Always," he said with a grim smile. "Lead the way." They moved through the corridors, the silence more oppressive than a Martian sandstorm. The air had that stale, recycled scent that never quite managed to scrub out the underlying hint of despair. Or was that just Sable's imagination running wild again? "I hate this place," Gideon muttered as they rounded a corner. "Why we ever think coming here was a good idea? Because it wasn't supposed to be a death trap," Sable replied, scanning the walls for any indication of what kind of alien tech they might be up against. "Just a routine maintenance job," they said. "Barely worth the jet fuel," they said. "Yeah, well, routine's overrated," Gideon replied, hefting his weapon like a safety blanket. "Give me a crisis any day. At least then I know where I stand." "Right now we stand on Mars," Sable pointed out, "and it's looking more like the inside of a bad sci-fi movie with every step we take." They came to a junction, the path splitting in two. One direction looked brighter, almost inviting if you ignored the occasional flicker of faulty lighting. The other was darker, the shadows practically oozing menace. "Left or right?" Gideon asked, raising an eyebrow. "Let's take the ominous path," Sable decided, turning towards the darker corridor. "Bad things always hide in the shadows." "Good call," Gideon said, following her without hesitation. "Wouldn't want to deprive ourselves of any potential suffering." "Where would be the fun in that?" Sable replied with a wry smile. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in like a physical force. Sable's nerves were jangling, a constant hum at the back of her mind that refused to be silenced. They moved cautiously, each step measured and careful, as if the floor might collapse at any moment. When they finally emerged into a wider room, it was filled with consoles and machinery that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of mad scientists on a budget. The centerpiece was a massive, pulsating orb of energy, suspended in midair by forces Sable couldn't begin to understand. "Wow," Gideon said, staring at the orb with the kind of awe usually reserved for ancient ruins or fancy pasta dinners. "That's something?" "Yeah," Sable replied, eyeing the contraption warily. "Looks like we found our control hub." "Now what?" Gideon asked, glancing at her for direction. "Now we figure out how to turn this thing off," Sable said, moving towards the consoles. "Or at least make it stop trying to kill us." Gideon snorted, keeping a watchful eye on the room as Sable approached the nearest console. It glowed with an ethereal light, the symbols scrolling across the screen like an alien language class gone horribly wrong. "Any idea what you're doing?" Gideon asked, as Sable began tapping buttons with the confidence of someone who knew they were probably about to make things worse. "Not a clue," she admitted, her fingers dancing over the keys. "But if Marlowe can guess his way through this, so can I." "Guessing's an underrated skill," Gideon said. "Right up there with surviving against all odds." Sable tapped a few more buttons, the console beeping indignantly at her interference. The orb in the center of the room shimmered, its light shifting like a mood ring on a teenager's finger. Sable," Gideon said, taking a step back. "I think you did something." "Yeah, I'm getting that impression," Sable replied, watching as the orb pulsed faster, its light filling the room with an eerie glow. "Maybe step away from the alien thing," Gideon suggested, his voice tense. "Good idea," Sable said, backing up to stand beside him. The orb continued to pulse, the machinery humming with a sinister energy. Sable and Gideon watched, tension coiling like a spring, waiting for anything to happen. And then, as if deciding they'd had enough of a staring contest, the orb flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "Did it work?" Gideon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or we just made things a whole lot worse," Sable replied, her eyes trying to adjust to the sudden absence of light. Before either of them could say anything else, the comms crackled back to life. "Sable, Gideon, you there?" Marlowe's voice was sharp with urgency. "We're here," Sable replied. "What's happening?" "Systems are going haywire," Marlowe said. "Shields are down, and I think we might have disrupted the lockdown." "That's good, right?" Gideon asked, sounding hopeful for the first time. "Depends," Marlowe replied. "I think we woke up whatever's running this place, and it's not happy." "Fantastic," Sable muttered. "Just what we needed." "Get back here fast," Marlowe urged. "We've got company." "On our way," Sable said, turning to Gideon. "Time to move." Together they sprinted back down the corridor, the darkness enveloping them like a shroud. Sable's heart pounded in her chest as they raced through the base, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. When they reached the common area, Marlowe was waiting for them, his expression surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "Glad you made it," he said, nodding. "What's the situation?" Sable asked, breathless. "Remember those nightmares we were talking about?" Marlowe said, gesturing to the screens. "I think they've taken a more physical form." Sable looked at the monitors, her stomach sinking as she took in the sight. Shadows moved across the displays, figures twisting and writhing like something out of a fever dream. "Looks like we're about to meet our worst fears," she said grimly. "Guess we won't need to worry about boredom," Gideon quipped, though his voice was strained. "Yeah," Sable replied, her gaze fixed on the screens. And this time, the nightmares aren't just in our heads. The Martian base seemed like the perfect place for a leisurely breakdown, the kind where your existential crisis is accompanied by the comforting embrace of potential death. Sable Thorne would have preferred a nice cup of coffee over this mess, but beggars couldn't be choosers, especially not on Mars. So, just to recap, Sable said, eyeing the flickering monitors. We've got a base on lockdown, nightmares given flesh, and alien tech that's more temperamental than a teenager with a curfew. Did I miss anything? Nope, Marlowe replied, fingers flying over his console. Just your average Tuesday. Gideon leaned against a wall, arms crossed, looking as calm as a person threatened by alien nightmares could manage. I don't know about you, but I'm getting real tired of surprises. Can we have a nice, predictable catastrophe for once? Sorry, no such thing, Sable quipped, shooting him a grin. If it was predictable, we wouldn't be here. Marlowe let out a low whistle, tapping a few more buttons. I've got a theory, he said, not looking up. What if we sabotage the extraction process? Shut down whatever's turning our dreams into. Whatever those are, he gestured at the screens. Sabotage alien tech, Gideon asked incredulously. On a good day, I can't even fix my toaster. Well, unless you've got a better idea, Sable said, crossing her arms, we're running with Marlowe's. It's either that or wait for our new nightmare friends to come say hi. Marlowe looked up, eyebrows raised. I vote for the sabotage. Personal preference to not die horribly. All right, Sable decided, we break it down. Marlowe, see if you can find a way to get us into the guts of this place. Gideon and I will play defense. Defense against what? Gideon asked, still trying to appear nonchalant. Anything that moves and doesn't look like it wants to offer us tea and cookies, Sable replied, already moving towards the exit. Tea and cookies, Gideon echoed dryly. That'll be the day. They made their way back through the dimly lit corridors, the base now humming with an unsettling energy. Sable's mind raced as she considered their options, the kind of race where all the horses were lame and betting on any of them was a fool's errand. You've got a knack for disaster planning, you know that, Gideon remarked, keeping pace beside her. I like to think of it as staying realistic, Sable retorted. Planning for the worst makes anything else seem like a pleasant surprise. So, what's the worst-case scenario here? Gideon asked, half joking but mostly curious. Well, we could blow the whole place up, Sable said with a shrug, or unleash something truly awful that's been dormant for eons. You know, standard stuff. I'll try not to think about it, Gideon muttered, gripping his weapon a little tighter. They reached what looked like another control room, this one dark and foreboding, as if it had been designed by someone who had a preference for mood lighting and a dislike for visitors. Lovely, Gideon said, peering into the gloom. Let's hope the alien decorators also left some handy instructions, Sable replied, stepping inside. The room was filled with consoles, each one glowing with an otherworldly light. Symbols danced across the screens in hypnotizing patterns, the kind that dared you to look away at your peril. Marlowe's voice crackled over the comms. I'm seeing a lot of activity from your location. Looks like you've hit the jackpot. Good news for once, Sable said, her eyes scanning the room. Define good, Gideon said, following her gaze. Sable moved to one of the consoles, her fingers hovering above the keys as if they might bite. All right, let's see what we're dealing with. The console responded to her touch with an alarming beep, the kind that usually accompanied an error message or a "you've made a huge mistake" alert. Come on, Sable muttered, tapping the keys with renewed fervor. The console began to pulse, lights flickering in a rhythmic pattern that suggested some kind of activity. I think we're onto something. Gideon shifted, glancing towards the corridor. Better make it quick. I think our friends might have caught wind of us. The monitors near the entrance flickered to life, showing a mass of writhing shadows converging on their location. Whatever the nightmares were, they were fast and they were coming. Well, that's just wonderful, Sable said, not bothering to hide her sarcasm. Gideon raised his weapon, his expression tense. Guess we get to test out our defense plan. Stall them as long as you can, Sable instructed, her focus returning to the console. I've almost got this. Gideon moved to the doorway, bracing himself for the inevitable. The shadows were close now, the darkness undulating like a living thing. He fired a warning shot, the sound echoing through the corridor with a sharp crack. "Feeling friendly today?" Sable asked, not looking up. "Just introducing myself," Gideon replied, eyes never leaving the approaching mass. The console let out a triumphant chime, the display shifting to a more comprehensible interface. Sable grinned, her fingers flying over the keys as she worked to disrupt the extraction process. "Almost there," she said, the words more for her own benefit than Gideon's. The shadows reached the doorway, hesitating as if sizing up their prey. Gideon didn't wait for a formal greeting. He opened fire, the weapon's report filling the space with a deafening roar. "We'll have to invite them to the after-party," he said, reloading. Sable kept her focus, eyes glued to the console as the alien systems responded to her commands. It was like learning to play a new instrument in the middle of a concert, but at least she wasn't tone-deaf. "Got it," she exclaimed as the console flashed a success message. "I've shut down the extraction." The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering as if caught in a moment of indecision. But Sable knew better than to think they'd just vanish. Nightmares were persistent after all. "Now what?" Gideon asked, stepping back from the doorway as the shadows started to regroup. "Now we get out of here," Sable said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Before they decide to throw us a welcome party." The two of them backed away from the consoles, Gideon covering their retreat with a few well-placed shots. The shadows writhed in frustration, but they didn't advance, as if unsure of their next move. "Looks like we rattled them," Sable said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "Yeah, but for how long?" Gideon asked, not letting his guard down. They made their way back through the corridor, the base now eerily silent. The shadows lingered at the edges of their vision, watching but not following. It was a small victory, but Sable would take it. "Marlowe, we're heading back," she said into the comms. "Extractions shut down, but the nightmares are still lurking." "Copy that," Marlowe replied, his voice tense. "I'll have things ready for you when you get here." They reached the common area where Marlowe was waiting with a relieved expression. "Nice work," he said, nodding at them. "Don't thank us yet," Sable warned. "We haven't exactly solved the problem." "No, but we've bought ourselves some time," Marlowe said, gesturing to the screens. The shadows were still present, but they seemed less aggressive, more like a storm that had lost its fury. "What's our next move?" Gideon asked, leaning against a makeshift barricade they'd set up earlier. "We need to find out where this tech is drawing its power from," Sable said, her mind racing. "If we can cut that off, we might be able to shut this place down for good." "Easier said than done," Marlowe said, though there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "What's life without a challenge?" Sable replied, her tone dry but determined. "Peaceful," Gideon offered, a wry smile on his lips. "Where's the fun in that?" Sable shot back, a hint of amusement in her voice. The three of them settled in, preparing for whatever came next. It wasn't much, but they had a plan, and sometimes that was enough to keep fighting. "So, who's up for saving the day?" Sable asked, her sarcasm masking the tension. "Sounds like a full-time job," Marlowe said, cracking a grin. "Yeah, with lousy benefits," Gideon added, checking his weapon. "Let's just make sure we get out of this alive," Sable said, her voice serious but her eyes bright with determination. The shadows lingered at the edges of their vision, a reminder of the danger that still loomed. But for now, they had a moment of peace, a chance to catch their breath and plan their next move. And on Mars, that was as close to a victory as anyone could hope for. The buzzing hum of the base was now more irritating than the Martian cold seeping through the walls. Sable Thorne found herself itching to punch something, ideally the alien tech that seemed hell-bent on making her nightmares everyone else's problem. But what would that achieve except a sore fist and a smug alien AI somewhere chuckling at her futile rage? Her stomach growled, reminding her that even in the depths of existential dread, hunger wouldn't be ignored. "Think the cafeteria's still open?" she asked, not entirely joking. Only if you're in the mood for reconstituted despair, Marlowe chimed in, his fingers dancing across the keyboard like a pianist at a funeral. Gideon, ever the ray of sunshine, leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. Do we count the nightmares as locale, or is that just wishful thinking? Knowing our luck, they're full of carbs, Sable snorted, glancing at the monitors, each displaying a different horror show. The alien patrols weren't just getting closer, they were getting cocky. If one of them had the audacity to knock, she'd have to resist the temptation to answer with a fist. They needed an edge, something sharp enough to cut through the alien tech like a steak knife through a rare ribeye. Assuming ribeye hadn't been deemed a rare artifact back on Earth these days. Think the aliens have a soft spot we can poke at? Gideon asked, his voice carrying that sarcastic drawl he used when he was about 3 seconds from throttling someone, usually Marlowe. Marlowe's working on it, Sable replied, pinning their hopes on the tech whiz that seemed more at home sabotaging alien tech than making small talk. Yeah, I'm on it, Marlowe muttered, squinting at a screen filled with symbols that looked like a toddler had gone wild with finger paints. You know, navigating alien software is a lot like a first date. Lots of guessing and hoping you don't screw up so bad you end up dead. Got any tips for either? Sable asked, trying to keep the mood light even as the shadows outside began a slow creep toward their little safe haven. Bring flowers to both, but don't expect a second chance, Marlowe replied, his focus unbroken. We should start charging you for this wisdom, Gideon added, peering out the window as if daring the nightmares to make a move. The three of them fell into a tense silence, the kind that wrapped around you like a bad blanket, full of holes and reeking of uncertainty. It was the calm before the storm, a cliché that seemed more comforting when faced with the alternative, chaotic alien storm, complete with a side of doom. Find anything useful yet? Sable asked, her patience thinner than the Martian atmosphere. Define useful, Marlowe said, not looking up. I've got a lot of definitely going to kill us and not enough might save our asses. Fantastic, Gideon drawled, so we're stuck between definitely and might. What will we do without you? Live a little longer, Marlowe shot back, a smirk ghosting across his lips. Sable rubbed her temples, trying to knead away the headache threatening to split her skull. We've got to find a way to isolate the power source. If this alien tech is like a bad marriage, maybe we can cut the strings and see what's left standing. That's your plan? Gideon asked, a dubious brow raised. Divorce the aliens. Well, it's either that or couples therapy, and I'm not in the mood for a heart-to-heart with a blob of nightmares, Sable replied, deadpan. Marlowe, can you pinpoint where the power's coming from? Gideon asked, slipping back into his more serious, war-hardened persona. Marlowe leaned in closer, his face bathed in the sickly glow of alien glyphs. Could be centralized, could be distributed. If it's the latter, we're in a world of hurt. Optimism. That's new, Sable quipped, though her mind was already racing through potential exits, pivots, anything that would give them a fighting chance. Hey, I live to surprise, Marlowe grinned, the kind of grin that suggested he was as surprised by his own survival as anyone else was. A sudden tremor shook the base, rattling the screens and sending an unsettling vibration through the floor. Marlowe's fingers flew over the keys, desperately trying to stabilize whatever was about to fail next. What's that? Sable demanded, tightening her grip on reality and her weapon. Looks like our uninvited guests are getting impatient, Gideon said, his voice a gruff calm that was both reassuring and terrifying. Marlowe cursed under his breath. They're trying to overload the system. Either they want us out or they're just in a hurry to redecorate. Guess they didn't get the memo about subtlety, Sable muttered, scanning the data for anything that could be twisted to their advantage. We need a distraction, Gideon said, his mind already running through scenarios, most of which ended badly. Something to buy us time. And by us you mean Marlowe, right? Marlowe interjected, not missing a beat. Naturally, Gideon said, you break it, you buy it. Sable's eyes settled on an icon flickering ominously in the corner of the screen. Can we overload them first? she suggested, an idea forming, cobbled together from desperation and a flicker of hope. Marlowe paused, considering it. It's risky. If we screw up, we're toast. And if we do nothing? Gideon asked. We're toast with a side of jam, Marlowe replied, his fingers twitching with the itch of a new challenge. All right, Sable said, decision made. Blow the system, scramble their comms. Let's make this nightmare their problem for once. Marlowe cracked his knuckles, a ritual as old as time. You got it, boss. They fell into the rhythm of chaos, each playing their part in the desperate dance of survival. Sable watched the screens, her stomach a knot of anxiety and determination. If they could just hold out a little longer, keep the nightmares at bay, maybe they'd find a way to live through this. As Marlowe began his digital assault, the base shook again, a deep rumble that spoke of power and fury, tempered by desperation. Sable gripped the edge of the console, bracing against the tremors, her mind racing with possibilities. Gideon kept watch, his eyes flickering between the shadows and the screens. If this doesn't work, I've got dibs on the last word. Make it a good one, Sable said, her voice tight but steady. Marlowe muttered a string of invectives at the console, his hands a blur as he worked to outsmart the alien tech. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, but he didn't dare wipe it away. We're in, he announced, his voice a mix of triumph and exhaustion. Now flip the switch and let's see them dance, Gideon urged, his weapon ready to greet any unwelcome visitors. Marlowe hit the final key with a flourish, a digital maestro conducting a symphony of chaos. The screens flickered, the bass groaned, and for a moment Sable thought she heard the alien tech scream, a sound like a chorus of nightmares denied their prey. Did it work? Sable asked, her eyes scanning for any sign of victory. Most of their comms are down, Marlowe confirmed, a weary smile tugging at his lips. They're blind but not deaf, so let's not stick around for an encore. Gideon glanced at her, a question in his eyes. Time to run. Run, walk, crawl, whatever gets us away from here, Sable replied, motioning them toward the exit. The base was a cacophony of lights and alarms, each sound a testament to their success and their ongoing peril. As they made their way through the corridor, Sable couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a rare and fragile thing in a world where nightmares had teeth. They reached the airlock, the final barrier between them and the uncertain safety of Martian wilds. Marlowe keyed in the sequence, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Ready? Gideon asked, his voice low and steady. Ready, Sable confirmed, gripping her weapon and her resolve. The airlock opened with a hiss, the Martian wind whipping through the gap like a thief in the night. They stepped out into the cold, the barren landscape stretching before them like a blank canvas waiting for their next move. We did it, Marlowe breathed, a mix of disbelief and relief. Yeah, Sable said, her eyes scanning the horizon. But let's not stick around for the applause. Gideon nodded, his eyes dark with determination. Time to find a new dance floor. They moved as one, a trio forged in the fires of desperation and survival. The shadows still lingered at the edges of their vision, but for now they were free. And on Mars, freedom was as precious as any victory. Sable jogged down the dim corridor like she was being chased by the world's worst personal trainer, her boots echoing against the metal floor in a rhythm that was more anxiety than athleticism. She could feel the pressure of the situation pressing down on her, as heavy as the Martian gravity after a bad night out. Survival wasn't just some punchline she could laugh off anymore. It was the kind of grim joke that stops being funny once it starts to bleed. She reached the common area, where Marlowe and Gideon were staring at the screens like they held the secrets to the universe, or at least a recipe for not dying horribly. Marlowe looked up, his expression a mix of exasperation and that eternal spark of defiance. Sable, you look like you've been running from your responsibilities again. Not just mine, Marlowe, Sable shot back, wiping the sweat from her brow. Yours too. Thought I'd save you the trouble. Gideon snorted, crossing his arms over his chest. If our responsibilities turn into a horror flick, I'm betting the aliens win the Oscar for Best Antagonist. Great. Our lives are a low-budget thriller, Marlowe muttered, eyes flicking back to the screens, fingers dancing over the keyboard in a desperate bid to hold their world together a little longer. The room vibrated with a low, angry hum, the bass's irritation seeping into their bones. Whatever Marlowe had done to scramble the alien comms had bought them a moment's reprieve, but like all good things, it wouldn't last. The nightmares were adapting, clawing their way back into control, and they were running out of tricks to keep them at bay. "How's it looking, Marlowe?" Sable asked, voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them. "Like a bad date," Marlowe replied, not missing a beat. "Full of miscommunication and impending doom. Sounds like my last relationship," Gideon added, peering out the window at the Martian landscape, now a hostile witness to their plight. "Aren't you glad you swiped right on this mission?" Sable quipped, her attempt to lighten the mood falling flat under the weight of their predicament. The screens flickered ominously, alien glyphs twisting like malevolent serpents. Marlowe's hands flew across the keyboard in a flurry of motion, but the sense of impending failure was hard to shake. It was like trying to wrestle a bear with one arm tied behind your back, possible in the realm of fantasy, but reality was a cruel, unforgiving beast. "We need a new plan," Sable said, trying to tamp down the rising tide of panic. "One that doesn't involve us getting killed or worse." "Define worse," Gideon said, his voice dry as a Martian dust storm. "Captured," Sable replied, the word hanging in the air like a death knell. "Right," Marlowe said, grimacing at the thought. "Because alien interrogation sounds like a great way to spend a Saturday night." Before anyone could respond, the base shuddered violently, throwing them off balance. Alarms blared, their shrill voices adding to the cacophony of disaster. The screens went dark, and in that moment of perfect stillness, Sable felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We've got company," Gideon said, his voice a grim acknowledgement of the inevitable. The air around them shimmered, a thin veil of reality that ripped apart as the alien force field collapsed, revealing their captors. They were tall and unsettlingly graceful, their forms a disconcerting blend of shadow and substance, eyes glowing with a cold, predatory intelligence. "Well, shit," Marlowe breathed, the words as good a summary of their predicament as any. The aliens moved with the fluidity of nightmares, and before Sable could even raise her weapon, she felt a sharp sting at the base of her skull. Darkness clawed at the edges of her vision and she fought against it, but the world was slipping away, fading into a swirling vortex of terror. Asterisk, 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 when Sable came to, everything felt wrong. Like waking from a dream you couldn't quite remember, but its lingering touch was enough to fill you with dread. She was lying on a cold, metallic slab, her body restrained by bonds that hummed with alien energy. The room was dimly lit, the shadows dancing mockingly in the corners. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Gideon's voice drawled from somewhere nearby. "For now, anyway." Sable struggled to sit up, the restraints holding firm. "Where are we?" "Somewhere south of Screwed and west of Hopeless," Marlowe replied, his voice tinged with a grim humor that was more defiant than resigned. The alien stood at the periphery, studying them with an intensity that suggested they were evaluating assets, not prisoners. One of them stepped forward, its voice a sonorous echo that reverberated in their minds rather than through their ears. "You will provide what we seek." "And what would that be?" Gideon demanded, his bravado a thin veneer over the fear that threatened to crack his composure. The alien's eyes glowed brighter, an unsettling luminescence that seemed to pierce their very souls. "Your nightmares." Sable felt a shiver trace up her spine. "You want our nightmares? Got plenty to spare." "Hope you've got a good therapist." Ignoring her, the alien gestured to the other captives, who began manipulating a floating console filled with alien symbols. The room filled with a low hum, a prelude to something much worse. "Brace yourselves," Marlowe muttered, his voice tight with tension. Their minds were invaded by shadows, tendrils of consciousness that probed their thoughts with merciless precision. Sable gritted her teeth trying to resist, but the alien presence was relentless. Memories she had long buried surfaced, each one a jagged shard of pain and fear. "Don't think about the spiders," Gideon advised, his voice strained but laced with that same gallows humor. "They love spiders." "I hate spiders," Marlowe interjected, his voice a ragged whisper. Sable fought to maintain some semblance of control, focusing on the here and now, on the bonds that held them all together. She could feel the others doing the same, their combined will a fragile bulwark against the onslaught. But it was like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve, impossible and infuriating. The aliens pressed harder, their hunger for nightmares insatiable. Sable felt her resolve slipping, the darkness inside her growing stronger, more insistent. She could see the shadows of her past, each one a reminder of failures and fears she couldn't quite shake. "Think of something happy," Marlowe said, his voice a shaky attempt at levity. "Like the time we almost didn't die." "Yeah," Gideon replied with a grim chuckle. "Or when we thought bad cafeteria food was our biggest problem." The alien presence wavered, momentarily confused by their resistance. It was a small victory, but in a situation like this, Sable would take what she could get. She latched onto that thread of confusion, pulling at it with everything she had. Marlowe's eyes flickered open, meeting hers across the room. "I've got an idea," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's risky, but it just might work." "What have you got to lose?" Sable asked, her voice raw but determined. Marlowe took a shaky breath, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "I'm going to try to overload their system. If I can create enough noise, we might be able to break free." "Sounds like a plan," Gideon agreed, his voice strong despite the situation. "Better than waiting around for them to dig out our deepest fears." The alien presence surged, a wave of darkness that threatened to drown them all. But Marlowe was already moving, his mind a whirlwind of electronic chaos as he reached out, probing the alien systems for a weakness. Sable focused her mind, lending what strength she could to Marlowe's efforts. She could feel the others doing the same, their combined will a beacon in the darkness. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was all they had left. The room trembled with a raw, uncontained energy, the alien systems groaning under the strain of Marlowe's assault. Sable could see the flicker of confusion in their captor's eyes, the first hint of panic as their control began to slip. "We're almost there," Marlowe gasped, his voice a tremulous thread of hope. With a final, shuddering blast, the restraint snapped open, the alien systems collapsing under the weight of their own complexity. Sable surged to her feet, shaking off the last vestiges of the nightmare that had threatened to consume her. "Time to go," Gideon said, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. They didn't need to be told twice. Together they dashed toward the exit, the shadows of their pursuers hot on their heels. The base was a maze of corridors and dead ends, but the adrenaline coursing through their veins pushed them onward, faster than fear. "Any idea where we're headed?" Sable asked, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Anywhere but here," Marlowe replied, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. Gideon led the way, his instincts guiding them through the labyrinth of metal and shadow. The aliens were close behind, their frustration palpable as they struggled to regain control. They burst into the open air, the chill of the Martian night wrapping around them like a shroud. The base loomed behind them, a hulking silhouette against the stars, but they didn't look back. There was no time for second-guessing, no time for regrets. "Keep moving," Sable urged, her voice fierce and unyielding. They ran, feet pounding against the red dust, each step a defiant challenge to the nightmares that sought to claim them. The horizon was a distant whisper of hope, and they chased it with everything they had. Sable glanced at her companions, their faces etched with determination. They were battered and bruised, but they were alive, and for now, that was enough. "Think we'll make it?" Marlowe asked, his voice a breathless blend of fear and exhilaration. "We've beaten the odds before," Gideon replied, his words a promise wrapped in irony. "And if we don't," Sable added, the question a dark cloud on the edge of her mind. "Then at least we go down fighting," Gideon said, his voice a resolute anthem in the night. They ran together under the Martian sky, unyielding and unbroken. The nightmares still lingered in the shadows, but they had found something stronger each other. And as long as they had that, they had a fighting chance. In a world where nightmares had teeth and reality was a cruel, capricious mistress, they were the stubborn survivors, the irreverent dreamers who refused to let the darkness win. The trio stumbled through the Martian dust, their lungs heaving like they'd just escaped a pissed-off bear. Or in this case, a pack of nightmare-fueled aliens. Gideon led the way, his sense of direction guided more by primal fear than any real knowledge of their surroundings. "Keep moving," Sable urged, though she was pretty sure her legs were about to file a formal complaint. "Yeah, because stopping to think is where things usually go wrong," Marlowe replied, his voice laden with a sarcastic drawl. They kept a relentless pace, the Martian landscape a series of reddish blurs in the dim light. Every so often, a shiver of adrenaline would spike through Sable, an unwanted reminder that their reprieve was a shaky, temporary thing. The aliens were still out there, and she suspected they weren't the forgiving type. They skidded to a halt behind a rocky outcrop, crouching low as if they could somehow make themselves invisible through sheer willpower alone. The base loomed in the distance, a hulking shadow against the faint glimmer of the horizon. "All right, genius," Gideon panted, glancing sideways at Marlowe. "You said you had a plan." Marlowe nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "Yeah, but it's not exactly foolproof." "Or sane." "Great, sounds like our usual style," Sable interjected, trying to steady her breath. "Spill it." Marlowe took a breath like a man preparing to dive off a cliff. "I think I've figured out the connection between our creativity and the nightmares. The aliens aren't just pulling random junk from our heads, they're feeding off our imagination, using it to power their tech. It's like a buffet and we're the main course." "Wonderful," Gideon muttered, massaging his temples as if he could knead the insanity of their situation into something less migraine-inducing. "How's that supposed to help us?" "By overloading their systems with our nightmares," Marlowe explained, his eyes alight with a mix of fear and excitement. "If we can amp it up, throw everything we've got at them, it might be enough to blow out their circuits." "Fantastic," Sable murmured under her breath. "We're going to weaponize our worst fears. What could possibly go wrong?" Gideon chuckled, though there was no real humor in it. "So, what do we do?" "Stand around thinking about taxes and X's until their heads explode." "More or less," Marlowe admitted, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "But we do it together. We focus on the most terrifying, absurd things we can imagine and hope it's enough to fry their systems." Sable sighed, glancing at her companions. "It's a Hail Mary play, but what choice do we have?" "Let's make those nightmares count." They settled into a circle, the rocky ground digging into their knees as they prepared for a mental battle that would make any therapy session look like a walk in the park. Sable closed her eyes, diving into the murky depths of her subconscious with the same enthusiasm one might reserve for diving into a septic tank. The memories came rushing back, each more grotesque and absurd than the last. A dinner with her in-laws that had gone catastrophically wrong. That time she'd stood naked in front of a room full of strangers, which was less a memory and more her brain's idea of a recurring joke. Next to her, Gideon seemed to be wrestling with his own demons, face contorting with a symphony of emotions. "I swear, if I live through this, I'm never complaining about the cafeteria's protein sludge again," he muttered, voice tight with concentration. Marlowe, for his part, looked like he was about to start giggling or crying. "I don't know if this is going to work," he said, voice thick with nerves. "But it sure beats sitting around doing nothing." Sable could feel the air around them shift, a strange, electric tension that hummed with possibilities. "Just keep going," she encouraged, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Think of the worst, like the absolute worst, and let's give these bastards a proper send-off." Together, they wove a tapestry of madness, each thread a unique, twisted reflection of their deepest fears and insecurities. The aliens, undoubtedly lurking in the shadows, seemed to sense the shift. The air shimmered as if reality itself was starting to unravel. And with a final, visceral mental push, the trio let their collective nightmares flood outward. The scream of otherworldly tech strained against the onslaught of human imagination, the air crackling with a chaotic energy that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. The Martian base groaned under the pressure, lights flickering like the world's most unreliable disco. Somewhere in the distance, a faint metallic wail echoed through the air, an alien death rattle if Sable was feeling particularly poetic. "Well, that's new," Gideon said, blinking in disbelief as he tried to process the sudden silence. "Did we just do that?" Marlowe let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady himself. "If we didn't, we've just proved that the universe has a really messed up sense of humor." Sable opened her eyes, the dim Martian night coming back into focus. The world felt different somehow, the oppressive weight of alien dread lifting like a fog burned away by the morning sun. I think we did it," she said, voice tinged with reluctant hope. "Don't celebrate yet," Gideon cautioned, though his own smile betrayed him. "We're not out of this mess until we're sipping cocktails back on Earth." Marlowe nodded, though his eyes were already scanning their surroundings with a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's get moving. If we've got a window to escape, we'd better use it before the universe decides to remind us we're not the heroes of this story." With newfound resolve, the trio rose to their feet, the Martian dust swirling around them like a promise of freedom. They moved with a shared sense of urgency, the nightmare of captivity left behind like so much cosmic debris. The base loomed closer, its outline no longer a symbol of despair, but a stepping stone to freedom. Sable felt her heart pound with each step, a rhythm that matched the relentless drive of determination thrumming through her veins. "Think we've stalled the aliens long enough for a getaway?" Sable asked, her voice a cautious blend of optimism and doubt. "Let's hope they're still picking up the pieces of their short-circuited brains," Marlowe replied, his grin brighter than it had any right to be. "Either way, we're going to find out," Gideon added, his tone a reflection of the grim humor that had become their lifeline. The base's outer perimeter came into view, the force field now a distant memory thanks to their earlier barrage of mental chaos. They paused briefly at the edge, exchanging looks that conveyed more than words ever could. "Ready?" Sable asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling within. Gideon smirked, a dark twinkle in his eyes. "Ready to remind the universe that humans aren't just nightmare fodder." Marlowe nodded, his face a mask of determination. "And if they've got a problem with that, they can take it up with our imaginations." Together, they crossed the threshold, the base's cold metal walls giving way to the vast expanse of the Martian landscape. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to forge, and that was enough for now. The stars twinkled overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. But in that moment, Sable and her companions didn't care. They had won a battle, not the war perhaps, but a battle nonetheless, and that was a victory worth savoring. As they moved forward, the haunting specters of their nightmares faded into the background, replaced by the resilient hope of a new dawn. And while the universe may not have been on their side, they had something better: each other. In a world where dreams could kill and reality was a fickle mistress, they were the defiant few who dared to stand and fight. And as long as they had that, the darkness didn't stand a chance. The Martian base loomed like an oversized tombstone, a monument to human arrogance and alien malice. Sable, Marlowe, and Gideon trudged toward it with the wary gait of people who had recently weaponized their own insanity. The idea was simple, if not a little deranged: use their deepest nightmares as a sort of psychic hand grenade to fry the alien tech. The execution, however, was bound to be messier than a politician's promise. As they approached the base, Gideon grunted, "Anyone else feel like we're walking back into a blender with a vendetta?" Marlowe chuckled, though it sounded more like a cough. Just remember, we're the ones wielding the nightmares. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf when you're volunteering to be Red Riding Hood with rabies? Great, Sable muttered, her voice dripping with irony. We're the lunatics running the asylum. Let's just hope the walls don't close in before we can blow them apart. They reached the base's entrance, the force field now a non-issue thanks to their earlier stunt of unbridled mental chaos. Sable braced herself, the recycled air inside the base tasting like disappointment and burnt toast. It was a smell she'd grown used to, but never fond of. Inside, the corridors were still dimly lit, shadows clawing at the corners like they knew something everyone else didn't. The base hummed with an almost mocking calm, as if daring them to try their little scheme. Sable tightened her grip on the comms device, its metal cold against her palm, a reminder that this was all riding on a wing and a prayer, or in this case, nightmares. "All right," Gideon whispered, though in the echoing corridor it felt like a shout. "We know the aliens feed off our imagination, right? So let's give them the mental equivalent of food poisoning." Marlowe nodded, his fingers dancing over a console like a concert pianist at a black metal gig. "I've rerouted some of the alien tech's processing power to this hub. We feed it too much too fast, the whole system goes belly up. Like a piñata full of bees," Sable quipped, her attempts at humor more for her own sanity than anyone else's. "Except the bees are angry existential crises." They gathered around the console, the screen flickering with alien symbols that looked like a child's attempt at hieroglyphs after a sugar binge. Marlowe tapped a sequence, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Remember, the goal is to overload their systems. Whatever you do, don't hold back. Let's turn the base into the biggest bad trip these aliens have ever seen." "Can't wait," Gideon said, his sarcasm barely masking the edge of tension in his voice. "I've always wanted my emotional baggage to serve a higher purpose." Like sabotage, Sable drew in a shaky breath, her mind a chaotic playground of fears and absurdities. She glanced at her companions, their faces set in determined angles. They might have been desperately improvising, but at least they were doing it together. "Ready, as I'll ever be," Marlowe said, his fingers still moving over the controls. "Let's give these aliens a taste of humanity's finest neuroses." With that, they closed their eyes, diving headfirst into the whirlpool of their subconscious. It was like releasing the floodgates of a dam constructed out of forgotten nightmares and unchecked anxieties. Sable's mind was a riot of chaos. A childhood fear of clowns evolved into a circus of horrors, her in-laws spontaneously combusting during dinner, and the ever-comforting thought that she might never escape the job she hated. Each thought was a jagged shard of terror, sharp enough to cut through the fabric of reality. Next to her, she could sense Gideon waging his own war, a storm of past failures, ghosts of choices that had gone spectacularly wrong, and the gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, he'd never be good enough. The air around him seemed to vibrate with the intensity of his inner turmoil. Marlowe, for his part, was broadcasting a symphony of absurdities, his mind flickering between images of alien invasions and the perpetual torment of being trapped in an endless bureaucratic hellscape. The absurdity mixed with genuine fear created a cocktail potent enough to melt any alien circuit board. The base began to react, shuddering under the onslaught of human imagination unchained. The lights flickered, and somewhere deep within the structure, the alien tech screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the corridors like a banshee with a megaphone. "That's it," Marlowe said, his voice strained but triumphant. "Pour it on, we're making them choke on our nightmares." The base's systems were short-circuiting, the once powerful machinery now overwhelmed by the barrage of human madness. The air was thick with tension, the very atmosphere pulsating as if caught in a riptide of dread. Sable could feel the shift, the alien grip on the base loosening as their technology began to buckle under the strain. It was like watching a giant stagger, the confident stride of invincibility reduced to a desperate stumble. Gideon's eyes snapped open, wild and almost gleeful. "We're doing it," he breathed, hardly daring to believe. "The bastards are actually going down." Marlowe didn't respond, too focused on feeding every last drop of chaos into the system, his eyes glued to the console as if his will alone could make it implode. The base erupted in a crescendo of noise, alarms blaring, machinery grinding in what sounded suspiciously like mechanical death throes. Sable felt the floor tremble beneath her knees, the vibrations resonating through her bones like a symphony of disaster. "All right, I think we're about to hit the point of no return," Marlowe warned, his fingers flying over the console as if trying to conduct an orchestra of destruction. "If we're gonna move, now's the time." "Say no more," Gideon said, already on his feet, his movements quick and precise. "Let's get out before this place decides to implode." The trio scrambled to their feet, urgency propelling them through the base with all the grace of a herd of caffeinated cats. The corridors blurred past, the disarrayed systems lashing out with flickering lights and the occasional burst of sparks. Sable's heart thundered in her chest, each beat a reminder of the thin line they walked between genius and insanity. They were in uncharted territory, their escape balanced precariously on the chaos they'd unleashed. The exit loomed ahead, a beacon of salvation amidst the storm of chaos. They pushed toward it, driven by the primal need to survive, to live beyond the madness they'd sown. As they burst out into the Martian night, the base shuddered behind them, the final groans of an alien machine succumbing to its own hubris. The force field they'd once feared was now a fading memory, the last vestiges of an alien grip dissolving into the dust. They collapsed onto the Martian soil, gasping for air, the enormity of what they'd done settling over them like a leaden blanket. The stars above were indifferent witnesses, twinkling serenely as if to say, "We knew you'd make it." Marlowe rolled onto his back, laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. "We did it," he marveled, shaking his head in disbelief. "We actually did it." Gideon joined in, his laughter a raw, unfiltered release of tension. "And here I thought we were all going to end up as alien chow." Sable sat up, grinning despite the exhaustion clawing at her. "Maybe we're not the heroes of this story, but we sure as hell made one hell of an ending." They sat there, basking in the surreal calm that followed their storm of chaos. The base, now a monument to their victory, stood silent behind them, a derelict reminder of the power of human imagination. "Think we'll get a medal for this?" Sable asked, her tone light, though a part of her wondered if there'd ever be anyone to tell their tale. "Probably not," Gideon replied, his voice rich with sarcasm. "But hey, we've got a hell of a story to tell at the next bar." "Assuming there's still a bar to go to," Marlowe pointed out, though his smile hadn't faded. "And if not, we'll just make one. The universe owes us that much." Together, they turned their gaze toward the horizon, where the first hints of a Martian dawn began to creep into view. It wasn't the end of their journey, not by a long shot, but it was a victory. And in this vast, uncaring universe, that was a rare and precious thing. As they prepared to rise and move forward, one truth lingered. They were survivors, tempered in the fires of their own fears and forged into something stronger. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And sometimes that's all you need. As the Martian dawn skulked over the horizon like a disinterested teenager, Sable, Marlowe, and Gideon dragged themselves to their feet, brushing off the reddish dust that seemed to cling to their spirits as much as their clothes. They stood there, three weary figures against the alien backdrop, with the crumbling base a silent testament to their victory, or insanity, depending on who you asked. "Well, that was a hell of a wake-up call," Marlowe said, stretching his arms and grimacing at the satisfying crack of joints. "I'd suggest breakfast, but I'm not sure I can face another bowl of reconstituted despair." Sable snorted, shaking her head. "I'd murder for a decent coffee," she replied, glancing back at the base that had almost been their tomb. "Or at least something that doesn't taste like it was brewed from Martian soil." Gideon, ever the pragmatist, ran a hand through his disheveled hair, and surveyed the scene with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We made it," he said, the words tinged with incredulity. "I half expected us to end up as a cautionary tale in some corporate training video." "Yeah, because don't piss off the aliens with your imagination would make a great team-building exercise," Marlowe retorted, rolling his eyes. "I can see it now. Remember, folks, your deepest fears can power intergalactic tech. Now who wants cake?" Sable chuckled despite herself. The absurdity of their situation was almost comforting. It was a reminder that they were still human, still alive. "We'll get out of here," she declared, with more confidence than she felt. "And when we do, we can tell Earth exactly what we found, or at least what tried to eat us." "Assuming anyone's listening," Gideon pointed out, his tone dry as the Martian air. "Our distress signal's probably rotting in some bureaucrat's inbox, along with our hopes and dreams." "Hey," Marlowe interjected, "let's not forget who we are. We're the people who gave nightmares a running start. If that doesn't get us some attention, nothing will." Their banter was a lifeline, pulling them away from the brink of despair that had yawned beneath them for far too long. As they debated their uncertain future, the first wisps of dust began to swirl around them, a gentle reminder that Mars had its own agenda and they were just passing through. "Okay, so what's the plan?" Sable asked, looking to her companions for input. "We can't stay here forever. Sooner or later, the lack of edible food and breathable air will become more than a minor inconvenience." "True," Gideon agreed, his brow furrowing as he considered their options. "But first, we need to reach whatever's left of our comms array. Maybe we can get a signal through now that the alien interference is down. Or at least send a strongly worded letter." "Yeah, because Dear Earth, please rescue us from our own stupidity will really grab their attention," Marlowe quipped, his fingers twitching as if itching to type out their grievances. Despite their banter, the underlying tension was palpable. They'd survived, yes, but the specter of what they'd faced lingered like a shadow, an ever-present reminder of the fine line between survival and annihilation. With a nod, they turned their backs on the wreckage of the base and began the trek towards the communications tower a mile away, their movements weary but determined. The red dust kicked up by their boots mingled with the pale dawn light, creating a surreal haze that seemed to blur the lines between dream and reality. "Bet it'll take us longer to get there than it took to blow up the base," Marlowe muttered, his gaze fixed on the distant tower. "Funny how destruction always seems faster, isn't it?" "That's human nature for you," Sable replied, her tone wry. "We can tear things down in an instant, but building them back up, that takes time, and caffeine." As they trudged on, the silence was broken only by their footsteps and the occasional curse when someone tripped over a rock. It wasn't exactly the heroic march of warriors returning from battle, but it was theirs. "Think anyone else has been through this?" Gideon asked, breaking the introspective quiet. "Other teams, maybe." "We can't be the first to stumble across alien tech 101. Marlowe shrugged, his expression pensive. "If they did, they either didn't make it or they learned to keep their mouths shut. Either way, not exactly reassuring." "Great," Sable sighed. "So we're either pioneers or the universe's punchline." "Probably both," Marlowe said, his grin crooked but genuine. "After all, we did just unplug an alien civilization with our collective neuroses." The tower loomed closer now, its shadow a stark contrast to the soft glow of the Martian morning. As they approached, the familiar hum of technology reached their ears, a sound that was both comforting and ominous, like the purr of a sleeping predator. "All right," Gideon said, as they reached the base of the tower. "Moment of truth. Let's see if we can get this thing to play nice." With practiced efficiency, Marlowe set to work, his fingers a blur as he coaxed the equipment back to life. The screens flickered to life, bathing them in a cool blue glow that was almost nostalgic. "Here goes nothing," Marlowe muttered, as he initiated the connection. "Cross your fingers, toes, whatever you've got." For a few tense moments, nothing happened. Then, with a pop and a hiss, the static cleared, and a voice crackled through the speakers, familiar, authoritative, and laced with a hint of exasperation. "This is Earth Command. Please state your identity and situation." The trio exchanged glances, a mix of relief and disbelief written across their faces. Marlowe leaned forward, his voice steady and determined. "This is Marlowe, Sable, and Gideon, part of the Mars survey team. We've had a bit of an alien encounter. Could use a pickup and maybe a stiff drink." There was a pause, and then the voice returned, incredulous but intrigued. "Alien encounter? You're not serious?" "Oh, we're serious," Sable said, stepping up to the mic, her voice as sharp as a razor. "We've got the nightmares and destroyed base to prove it. You want details, we'll give them, just get us the hell out of here first." Another pause, then the voice softened, perhaps realizing the gravity of the situation. "Understood. Stand by for extraction. We'll dispatch a retrieval team immediately." "Thanks," Gideon added, relief evident in his tone. "And tell them to bring snacks. We've had just about all the Martian sand we can handle." As the connection closed, Marlowe leaned back, a satisfied smile playing at his lips. "Well, I believe that's what they call a successful negotiation." "Yeah," Sable agreed, a note of triumph in her voice. "Now let's just hope they don't take their sweet time getting here." With their message sent and rescue en route, they settled in to wait, their earlier tension giving way to a cautious optimism. The ordeal was over, for now at least, and they could finally breathe a little easier. As they sat there, gazing out at the Martian landscape that had almost been their grave, Sable mused aloud, "Think we'll get hazard pay for this? Or just a stern talking to about playing nice with extraterrestrial tech?" Marlowe chuckled, shrugging. "Either way, we've earned a story or two, and I'm betting it won't be long before someone else tries poking the cosmic bear." Gideon snorted, shaking his head. "Let's just hope they pack a bigger lunch, or at least some better jokes." The humor was a balm, easing the raw edges left by their brush with oblivion. They'd faced down the alien unknown and lived to tell the tale, their scars a badge of honor in a universe that rarely awarded second chances. As the sun rose higher, the Martian winds kicked up, swirling around them like a dance of forgotten memories. It was a new day, a day they weren't guaranteed but had claimed with stubborn defiance and just a hint of madness. And as they waited for their ride home, one thought lingered in the back of their minds. They might not be the first to face such challenges, but they certainly wouldn't be the last. Humanity had a knack for poking its nose where it didn't belong, but they'd also shown they could hold their own when the universe pushed back. "Well," Sable said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I guess we've got a bit of a wait ahead. Anyone up for a game of I Spy? I'll start. I spy with my little eye something red." Marlowe groaned, laughing despite himself. "Oh, come on, Sable. That's literally everything here." "Exactly," Sable replied, her grin wide as the Martian horizon. "Keeps things interesting." As they settled into the rhythm of banter and shared stories, the weight of the past few days began to lift, leaving behind only the bonds forged in adversity and the promise of what lay ahead. In the end, they were survivors, not because they'd been the strongest or the smartest, but because they'd been the most stubborn. And sometimes, in a universe that didn't care much for happy endings, that was enough. With the Martian sun warming their backs and the prospect of rescue on the horizon, they were content to leave the last word to the stars. Because after all, they'd earned it.